So we've had a number of significant developments in the energy transition sector during Q3. The most notable of these, in my eyes at least, being the UK's first ever carbon storage licensing round, highlighted by that strong green presence in the UK's project count. The NSTA awarded a total of 21 licenses to 14 companies, and these areas cover around 12,000 square kilometres and have the potential to collectively sequester up to 30 million metric tonnes of CO2 annually by 2030, which is roughly equivalent to 10% of the UK's current yearly emissions. It's also worth mentioning the strong UK showing of hydrogen and wind. This has been spurred on by a series of nationwide tenders, including multiple offshore wind auctions, as well as the country's first ever hydrogen allocation round. As you can see in this inset, which forms part of our quarterly energy transition activity summary map, we've got some major players, including BP, Shell, Perenco and ENI, all securing licenses off the Norfolk coast. The success of the storage round comes as welcome news for the UK, since the outlook for its growing offshore wind sector has faltered as of late, and after it held a rather lacklustre fifth contract for difference round in early September, in which 3.7 gigawatts of renewable capacity was awarded. However, notably, this didn't include any offshore wind projects at all. And we can attribute this absence to both ongoing inflation and supply chain challenges. And it throws a bit of a spanner in the works if the UK is going to meet its target of amassing 30 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2030. The quarter's also seen some historic developments in Africa. Djibouti has just launched its first ever wind development, a 60 megawatt project which is expected to increase the country's power production by 50%, and consequently this will play an important part in weaning the nation off foreign electricity imports, which are currently being sourced mainly from Ethiopia. If we just take another look at that chart, both RWE and Vattenfall have emerged as winners in Germany's second 2023 offshore wind auction, held in August, adding to the positive momentum in the country's offshore wind sector, as shown by that strong orange presence in the German project count. And finally, although not on the chart, I'd also like to highlight Albania's very first onshore wind auction, which was held at the end of July and was financially supported by the European Bank's EBRD programme. So this year has been a bit of a mixed bag for the renewables sector as a whole. Wind continues to dominate, but we're beginning to see solar start to catch up. Probably one of the biggest blows to the industry came in August, when investors pulled the plug on a record amount of funds from the iShares Global Clean Energy ETF, which represents Europe's largest thematic exchange-traded fund, totaling a net withdrawal of $765 million. Now, this number is particularly significant as it represents the largest outflow of investor funds ever recorded during any January to August period. And it hasn't really been an amazing year for offshore wind either. Despite the positive results from recent European tenders, the US's first ever Gulf of Mexico wind auction, held in late August, fell very flat, with neither of the two offered Texas offshore areas receiving any bids, although we did see RWE securing the Lake Charles lease area off Louisiana with a bid of $5.6 million. Prior to the sale, hopes had been relatively high, particularly following the results from similar federal wind lease sales, most notably last year's record-breaking sale in the New York Bight, with the 6 offered areas garnering $4.37 billion for the US Treasury. We believe that the lack of interest can largely be attributed to the region's relatively low wind speeds and higher risk of hurricanes, coupled with ongoing supply chain concerns. However, on a positive note, there have been some silver linings. Solar is continuing to grow, and by the end of 2023, photovoltaic additions are expected to account for 2/3 of the year's increase in renewable power capacity, and it's a trend that we expect to see carry on into 2024. A recent example of this solar progress can be seen in Romania, where the government recently greenlit 1.3 gigawatts of solar capacity across 7 projects, with plans to tender a further gigawatt before year's end, as the country sets its sights on achieving 30% of renewables in its energy mix by 2030. So, what do we expect to see in Q4? Well, here's a sample of some of the ET projects and tenders that we could potentially see launching in Q4, including several historic tenders with Colombia, Portugal and Estonia all poised to launch their respective first ever offshore wind auctions, as well as the UK's second hydrogen allocation round, which aims to deliver up to 1 gigawatt of electrolytic hydrogen production capacity either in construction or operation by 2025. Q4 is also the quarter in which we had been expecting to see full operations underway at Vattenfall's 1.5 gigawatt HKZ offshore wind farm in the Dutch waters of the North Sea. However, last we've heard, installation is currently behind schedule, and we're now expecting completion in either Q1 or Q2 of next year. Looking further ahead and at a more macro scale, depending on weather conditions, 2024 might just become the very first year where we see more electricity generated globally from renewable sources than from coal. In fact, it's expected to account for over 90% of the expansion in global electricity generation. And if all goes as projected, renewables could very shortly become the world's primary source for electricity. We're also expecting the production capacity of solar PV systems to double by 2024, reaching 1 terawatt for the very first time. However, there is a bit of uncertainty regarding the growth of wind power tech manufacturing in 2024. A lot will depend on whether governments take action to address ongoing permitting issues and auction challenges through appropriately supportive policies.